Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Our fourth item of business this morning is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. This sets out how the Government intends to meet its carbon reduction targets. The committee is leading a cross-committee effort to scrutinise the draft plan, and the Scottish Government said that it will lay the final plan by the end of March. Everyone giving evidence today will be contributing towards a report which we'll publish hopefully in late February with a debate in the Chamber following. I'd like to welcome to the meeting Lloyd Austin, Policy Advisor for Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, Professor James Curran, Member of the Climate Emergency Response Group, Dr Mark Winskall, Senior Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, Jess Pepper, the Founder and Director of Climate Cafe, and Professor Kevin Anderson, Professor of Energy and Climate Change for the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Thank you all for attending this morning. And the session is intended to give us an overview of the whole draft climate plan regarding rather than any specific policy. We're going to go straight to the questions, and as convener I get to ask the first question, which is always the easy question, the warmer into the bank, as it were, to allow you to express your views. I have said to, or I will say to you, it's not going to be possible with 5 people on the panel to get you to answer every single question that's put to you. So, to help me, if you agree with something somebody said earlier, you don't have to repeat it. It would be great if you could just say, oh, I agree or I don't agree, and then explain why. It just saves a bit on time. We've got about 2 hours for this session. So it's 7 years since we had a full climate change plan and 5 years since the climate change plan update. A lot of countries, including Scotland, adopted an ambition for net zero emissions with the intention of reaching the Paris Targets Agreement on temperature increase. Things have changed in your view, and you'll all get a chance to answer this. What are the key things that changed? And I'm going to start with Lloyd, go across the panel, and then come online. So, Lloyd, over to you.
Thank you, convener, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. Things that have changed since last time. Well, I think the main thing that's changed is probably the passage of time. So some of the policies and proposals in the last climate change plan and its update have been implemented, some have not, and that's been a significant problem. In recent years, of course, we've changed from annual targets to the new 5-year carbon budget system, and that was in part due to a series of missed targets and advice from the Climate Change Committee that the 2030 target was going to be difficult to meet. Despite the progress on reducing emissions from the 1990 baseline, about 50% so far, that's good progress, but we have to recognise that we've kind of done the low-hanging fruit, and so we've in the second half of reducing emissions to net zero, we've got some difficult choices to make, and I think it's important that we make those difficult choices, and I'm not quite sure that this plan does make those and deliver that. Nevertheless, it's welcome that there is a draft plan, and it's very welcome. It was delayed, of course, by all the process of switching from annual targets to 5-year budgets. But we're here now, we've got a plan, and it's very welcome that there is this scrutiny and consultation process. And one hopes that that's going to deliver a stronger, better final version of the plan before the election, although that's a difficulty in itself in terms of the timeline for taking into account all of the impacts of and the information that's gathered through the scrutiny and consultation processes.
Okay, thanks, Lloyd. I think that the point that you make, I'm going to ask other panellists as we go along to reflect on it as well, is for those with memories of this Parliament would know that just before the last election we got to the stage where we had a climate change plan that was put forward, and we had some targets that were put in which certainly were headline grabbing but proved unachievable. And we're now in a similar situation where we're going to be looking at this climate change plan in the dying days of this Parliament, just before dissolution and the election, when we could have been looking at it in 2023, but the government decided to delay that. So, James, when you're reflecting what's changed, could you say whether you're concerned as well with where we're at? Because it certainly concerns me, James.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and thank you to the committee for inviting me along here. What's changed? Well, yes, I am very concerned, because what has changed at the global scale is that climate change seems to be accelerating, and we are already above 1.5 degrees centigrade. And even some work I've done is beginning to show that global natural sequestration of the terrestrial biosphere is beginning to fail. So a lot of those mechanisms that we hoped would increasingly save us from the repercussions of climate change are showing signs of failing. And that is a very significant concern at the technical end of climate science. Within the role here in Scotland, I mean, I've been involved in climate change from the very earliest days, since actually 1990. And I was always very proud of Scotland taking a genuine world leadership role. And I think we're beginning to lose that, which is a pity. And I agree entirely with Lloyd that we've done a lot of the easy stuff. And now we're into the much more difficult stuff that involves much wider stakeholders and impacts more on the wider population. So that makes it a little bit harder, which is why the new versions of the climate change plan really do need to have some very thorough governance and delivery mechanisms in there, because it's no longer quite as simple as it used to be. And I don't see them. I don't see them there.
Okay, Mark.
Yes, thanks to the committee. I'm Mark Winskill. I'm here as, I imagine, a representative of the UK Energy Research Centre. So I'm a Deputy Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. I wanted to say I'm speaking individually today. I'm not speaking on behalf of our centre. We're developing a written proposal to the government, but we haven't finalised that. We're talking to the government hopefully early next year. We haven't been involved in the development of the draft. Well, in terms of the energy world, an awful lot has changed. There's been huge changes since the last plan. So I think I gave evidence in 2017. The energy world has been transformed in that time. In many ways, it's politically and economically, there are stronger headwinds, I would say, for the development of climate policy. Some of those things have been referred to already. The evidence on public priority around climate have changed a bit, so this isn't quite as a priority issue for large parts of the public as it probably was in certainly 2019. I think I remember being here in 2019 and giving evidence to a different committee. So the challenge is more acute in some ways, but I think it's also important to say that some things are looking much more encouraging. So costs of renewables technologies have come down very dramatically in that period. I was looking at the Scottish Fiscal Commission report this morning for breakfast, and I saw their revisions they based their recent report on they've looked at the Climate Change Committee's 7th Carbon Budget Advice and updated their own estimates of costs to Scotland based on the difference between 6th and 7th Carbon Budget Advice from the CCC. And there are very dramatic cost reductions. So the pathway is in many ways cheaper, particularly for renewables electricity. So there are some good enablers of change in that period too. I think I'll leave my comments on the draft till later. I don't think that was really what you were asking about, was it?
No, but I'm interested to know whether you feel that there's, or whether you have fears about the fact that this is, having given evidence in 2017, and I think, and you said later again, that we're in the last 3 months of this Parliament with a little break for Christmas in the middle, and we're still trying to find our way through the plan. Does that concern you?
Of course it does, yeah. I think that's a widespread concern. I've been to one or two stakeholder workshops on this, and it's a very widespread concern. I think that's obviously a concern. It's far from ideal. It does, you know, a lot of people are putting quite a bit of effort into responding to the government consultation and to Parliament questions. We submitted a response to your earlier call, and the timeline is so tight. It's a concern about how differently the final will look to the draft. I mean, that's an obvious concern, yeah.
Well, I think we have a month from once the consultation's finished to find out. Jess?
I agree, and I'll try not to cover the ground that's already been covered, but just to acknowledge, you know, we're in a climate and nature emergency, and therefore one thing that's accelerating is the impacts and the devastation from those impacts. We're seeing them here in Scotland, and they're impacting on lives and livelihoods and across the board, but also internationally. We're in touch with our Climate Cafe colleagues in Indonesia, hearing about the utter devastation that there's been there recently. So I think it's important to remember that this is not just any plan. This is our climate change plan, and our globally, Scotland has been acknowledged as a leader, and therefore it's important that we really do this for Scotland, but also for our international example. Obviously, that's what's been referred to already has been the shift in the framework in Scotland, and the other thing which is shifting amongst society is the growing concern and anticipation and interest in this plan. People are raising their own voices. We are inundated with inquiries for people creating spaces and support for those spaces to talk more and understand what they can do and how they can be involved in action, but also to know that we've got this, you know, that we know what we're doing as a nation as well. Just to come to where we're at now and lessons learned from last time. Last time there was a sense that the process of development had been quite narrow, and I think that came across in some of the questioning in the committee at the time. And there wasn't an awful lot of evidence provided of broad stakeholder engagement, participation in development of the plan. And in contrast, at the time, the parliamentary scrutiny process was really broad, and it was open and inclusive and participative, involving across several committees as it does now, and involved all sectors. So, for example, there was a round table where all sectors got into more of the nuanced detail about what each sector could contribute, which was over and above what had been mentioned in the Climate Change Committee advice. And that allowed everybody to hear what was possible and what resources might be needed and where there might be connections and collaborations and what people could do from their own experience. And a huge raft of recommendations obviously went to that plan, and unfortunately there just wasn't the time to then pick up on those and integrate them properly into the plan. And for me, that was an opportunity missed. And actually, we probably could have got an awful lot closer to the ambitions that were set out at the time, had all of those sectoral voices and others been heard and taken into account. This is going to take us all, so we need to have the clarity of a strong, robust plan that's been developed broadly, and therefore that will bring in ownership and delivery. One of the concerns that we have at this time is not just that there's not an awful lot of time to get things into the plan, but, and hopefully, you know, I'm intending to bring today things which could improve it, but also how people can be involved. This is over this time of year, not just the time that we've got. I know that we'll go into more detail, but one concern is that who will be left out. You know, we know where there's going to be engagement and opportunities to input into the plan, but those who will be left out, you know, that's quite important. Often those will be people who are leading in terms of climate action in their own communities across regions, knowing the local knowledge and understanding about what solutions are possible and what they're doing themselves. And that's the worry, is that that doesn't get heard and included in the final plan.
Thank you. Kevin.
Since Paris, we've emitted globally between just over 1/3 of 1 trillion tonnes of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the carbon budgets have reduced by that much since Paris. That's a huge quantity. As James points out, we have an improved understanding of the science on the issues of aerosols, on the issues of some of the other feedbacks and so forth. We now look at the carbon budgets that are available for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, and they're smaller than we thought from the science, and they're smaller because we've squandered our opportunity by putting lots more emissions into the atmosphere. So if we look at 1.5 degrees centigrade now, we've got we're almost at it. We've probably got 130 billion tonnes that we can emit globally. That's 3 years of current emissions, 3 years. To stay at 1.5 now, globally, we need to reduce emissions at between 20 and 25% per annum. In other words, it's not achievable. The much, much riskier 2 degrees C framing of Paris, we probably have somewhere around about 500 to 600 billion tonnes. That's 8% per annum reductions every single year. So the ongoing failure at the global and the national levels, there are no climate leaders on climate change. No nation is showing progress on this. When you add all of that together, we're in a much, much more serious situation we were than at Paris or at the time of the Climate Change Act in Scotland in 2019. I would also, this sounds hard, but I would slightly disagree with Mark in the way he framed that there was some positive news. I have to remind ourselves, the climate does not care about renewables. The climate does not care about efficiency. It only cares about CO2 and other greenhouse gas molecules. So unless we eliminate the use of fossil fuels and dramatically cut back our emissions from agriculture, but particularly on fossil fuels, unless we eliminate them, then the temperature simply just keeps going up. So reducing the amount of fossil fuels still means the temperature rises. You have to stop them, and then very slowly the temperature will stabilise and start to come down. So all we've done so far at the global level is reduce the size of the steps we're taking backwards, because it's a cumulative problem. And I think this, gives us a much sort of more honest reflection that we are not making progress. We are only going backwards. And even the small steps that we think of moving in a forward direction aren't. They're just smaller steps backwards than they may otherwise be. The other things that have changed, I think, significantly is we understand some of the impacts. So things like AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which could have dire implications for continental Europe, for Europe, significantly for Scotland. Scotland would be more on line with Labrador. So in the winter, it would be more like minus 15 degrees centigrade. You think about that in terms of the housing quality in Scotland. I mean, people would be dying in their houses. Now, beforehand, if you go back 10 years ago, people thought things like AMOC, this part of it is the Gulf Stream, that's the language we might more commonly use, that wasn't a high chance of reversing or stopping. Now, there's a significant risk of that occurring. And there's no plans in Scotland or the UK or rest of Europe to deal with what the implications of that would be. At the legal side, we've got people like the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, now giving their advice on 1.5 degrees centigrade. And without going into any details, I know that there are court cases now to take other countries to court for their production and ongoing sales of fossil fuels. So we've got a whole suite of things there. We've got the science, which is telling us basically that we're going to hell in a handcart very quickly. We've got the emissions, which we see are still going up. Emissions are not coming down. And even in countries like Scotland or the UK or most of the rest of continental Europe, we're only just playing with the emissions. I mean, they're dropping by the odd % or two every so often. And then we've got a legal framework which says we've got to stick to 1.5, which we've virtually gone past. So I'm sorry to say, in 2025, there is no good news. There's less bad news, and we can polish that if we want to. Or we can just stare directly at the challenge we face and then say, what do we need to do to respond to a climate emergency? The Scottish Parliament declared a climate emergency in 2019, I think it was. This plan here is not an emergency plan. So at the moment, Scotland, like every other country, it's polishing failure.
Right, okay. That's quite stark. And I'm sure the committee will pick up on that as we go through. And I noticed some of the panellists nodding when you were making those comments. Be up for them to build on it. Mark, the next questions are from you.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'm quite struck, actually, by comments there from Kevin Anderson. I suppose it begs the question around whether, we're kind of sitting in a consensus at the moment. There's very much a consensus between UK Climate Change Committee and governments across the UK. The consensus is around a balanced pathway, and this draft plan, from what we can see, reflects that kind of balanced pathway. It's in the art of what is politically possible within the current context. Does that reflect the emergency that we're in? Because we obviously take the advice of the UK CCC. We're following that middle path. Is that okay? I mean, should we be sticking to net zero by 2045? Does this plan reflect the urgency of that? Mark, do you want to?
Shall I?
James, do you want to come in first?
Respond initially. I'm sure the others will all respond. In summary, I agree with everything Kevin said. It is that scary. And I referred earlier to what that means to me and to the Climate Emergency Response Group that I'm here representing. Regard, I guess, as the predominant failure in this current draft plan. And I believe you've had quite a bit of submission on this issue already, but it's about the extent to which there is any delivery mechanism evident within the plan. I mean, we all welcome the plan, and we welcome its ambition and reaching net zero in 2045, and a lot of the elements to get to that point are there in the plan. But there seems to be a void on the pathway to actually deliver all those commitments, and it is that delay in delivery that is happening globally, that Kevin referred to, that is worsening and tightening the screw on the crisis. The figures that he mentioned on how rapidly we now need to decarbonise are really overwhelmingly hard to meet. But if we mean anything by an emergency, then we should be putting every effort into treating it as an emergency and doing something about it. Now, very recently, September 2025, CERG, Climate Emergency Response Group, issued, I think, a very useful report called Embedding Delivery in Scotland's Climate Change Plan. It's maybe been shared with you. It's certainly available on the website. And it even lists 8 questions that should be asked of the plan, all relating to aspects of delivery. And I think on every one of those questions, the answer would be no, it's not there. I wonder if I can indulge myself just very briefly. I'll try to keep it brief. I know the others will want to come in. But it's over 10 years ago, I was personally named as the responsible person to deliver the Flood Risk Management Act in Scotland. Now, I was working for SEPA at the time, and the task of operationalising that act, which is huge and highly technical, was literally landed on me as the named individual. Quite scary, but it seems to me there are so many analogies with how that was delivered and how a climate change plan needs to be delivered, because it involved all 32 local authorities, 2 national parks, Scottish Water, Nature Scot, SEPA, of course, the Met Office, various consultancies, Scottish Government, of course, many local community groups, and it's a highly political issue, flooding, both local authority politics and national politics. So all the elements were there to make that a really hard task, and it had to be delivered to a very tight deadline, or the European Commission would have heavily fined. So I followed the path of a very robust, professionally managed system, and at one point I had about 100 of my staff in SEPA working on it. There were probably several hundreds across Scotland and the various other organisations, and it was held together by 4 professional programme and project managers. They managed the whole system. They worked out the pathways from the intention to the deliverables. They looked at the milestones, they looked at the interdependencies, they looked at the risks, they assessed the true deliverables, and of course they monitored and evaluated throughout and reported it back to the programme board, which I chaired. I see every parallel between that task and the climate change plan. And it was delivered within budget and within time. And I see no reason that the same approach can't be applied to the climate plan, must be applied to the climate plan, if we actually mean to deliver it and contribute to, hopefully, addressing the emergency.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think we can come back to aspects around delivering governance a bit later on, but any quick thoughts on my initial question there? Jess, I think you wanted to come in, did you?
Yeah, I think we... Do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Yeah, we need to be hearing sirens. This is, just to add to the points previously made, but this needs to be a really robust plan and a kind of process. If we, here we are, if we're acknowledging the scale of this emergency and the scale of what we have to achieve here, then it needs everybody to muck in. We need to bring everybody together. We all need to have ownership of this plan. The process, we can maybe talk more about the process to getting here, doesn't scream of that kind of process at this moment. Maybe, there's more to come through this, through the consultation. But there are certain things, as James has alluded to, that are reasonable to expect in this plan, particularly this plan, the specific steps, how we're going to achieve things, the timelines, the milestones, the who is going to be leading, what are the roles and responsibilities that are in there. And certainly I'm getting this feedback from the cafes who've looked at it so far, which obviously they haven't had very long to look. So some of them will look this month and some will look in January. The community-led cafes tend to often eat monthly, so they have to fit it into their gatherings when they do that. But they're expressing challenges and just reading across it and understanding how things relate to each other, and then even to respond to the questions which are being asked of it, because it's not easy for them to navigate. You kind of have to dig in and untangle it a bit. So, we really need that robust clarity and for folk to be involved. And if there was more of that visible, and it may be that it's there, but we just can't see it in terms of understanding who has been involved in the development of this plan, then we might get a better sense of how that has come together. So, civic society has, since 2019, been developing and having these conversations, from the big climate conversation, I don't know if you remember that, in summer 2019. Communities participated actively in that, but haven't heard what happened to all of the ideas and the actions and the solutions that they provided. We don't know what happened to those things. There were over 1,000 specific actions that came from the climate emergency summits. That was a whole series of summits that I was involved in developing those with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society and a collective. And it brought together leaders in business, communities, expertise from all sectors. It was, throw the gates wide open. What can we all do to get, the best suite of options here? Obviously, Stop Climate Chaos Coalition have produced their policy proposals, which are deep and detailed. The Climate Emergency Response Group as well, the Scottish Climate Assembly, the children's contributions from the Scottish Climate Assembly, all the recommendations from the People's Panel, from Audit Scotland, and the recommendations that came from the last scrutiny of the last climate change plan. All of these things are out there, and it's just difficult to understand how they've been taken on board, whether they've been thought through. There's no follow-up dialogue that we're aware of. Maybe there is, but it's not kind of clear within the supporting papers.
More ambition if those ideas are kind of brought in, I guess.
Sorry, I missed the first part.
From your perspective, there's room for more ambition if those ideas are kind of brought in. It's not clear how they have been.
Yeah, we're not starting from scratch.
Can I move sort of briefly? I'm aware of time, but if I can move sort of briefly to Mark, Lloyd, and then Kevin.
Okay, so I think we're talking about different things here. There's comments on the adequacy of the plan. And I share a lot of what's being said already about the way the plan is presented, the concerns about the evidence, the way the evidence trail isn't really there in terms of connection between analysis, policy costs, and the overall kind of policy package and effort across different sectors. I don't know if we want to talk about that in a lot of detail, but there's clearly some, other sessions of the committee have expressed some concerns about those things too. In terms of the overall pace of delivery, I think I do differ a bit here. So the Committee on Climate Change doesn't work in the realm of what's politically possible, which is, I think, the way you introduced it. The Climate Change Committee works on an evidence basis, across the best evidence base it can assemble across all kinds of different commissioned work, academic reviews, in-house analysis, consultancy modelling, and so on. So what it does then is recommend pathways for delivering. So it's recommended the carbon budgets, which the government has largely accepted. The overall budget envelopes have been accepted by government. And the committee has said that these are feasible, deliverable budgets, the interim budgets and the budget to 2040 and then net zero by 2045. So that's seen as feasible against all kinds of criteria: economic, supply chain development, pace of change, public acceptability, all kinds of things the committee will look at. The question of going faster, and obviously Kevin is absolutely right in terms of the climate science and the lack of international progress since then. But Scotland has a job to deliver net zero by 2045. The CCPU set an interim target for 75% by 2030, which the Climate Change Committee decided was not feasible in terms of all the analysis that it could muster. And I know people will differ about this, because I know Kevin is a critic of this, but I'm a big fan of the Climate Change Committee's work, and there was always a concern in the CCPU as published. There was always a concern about the deliverability of the interim target. Now, people have different accounts of why that target had to be rescinded. Depending on who you speak to, it will be a lack of effort and a lack of so on. Other people will say there wasn't an evidence base to deliver pace at that speed, particularly in the building sector. It was too ambitious. You couldn't convert half of Scottish homes within about half a decade, by the end of the decade in which it was published. So it was an incredibly ambitious pace of delivery. Okay. Now, the current plan is incredibly ambitious. I know it's not enough for many people, and in many ways the climate science suggests it, but if all countries were doing what Scotland's doing, we'd be in a much better place than where we are now. So the pace of change, if one looks at the plan in detail, or just at the broad level, and the way it's being developed, the pace of change in transport is a huge ambition in the plan. And also in buildings. Not as much as before, but the committee now thinks that that pace of change is deliverable. Okay. It's easier to go fast in transport than it is in buildings because of the capital stock lifetimes and so on.
We'll come to those sectors a little bit later, but thanks.
My overall point is that the committee, the Climate Change Committee, has identified a feasible pathway to deliver these ambitious targets, interim and final, and we can work with that.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Lloyd, do you have anything to add to that, or I could just bring back to Kevin briefly?
A couple of things. I agree with Kevin's sort of global warning, and I agree with James's sort of comments about delivery within Scotland. I think overall, the net zero by 2045 target is a good contribution by Scotland to the global emergency if we are able to meet it. The CCC does provide advice as to how that can be done, and it is slightly moderated by feasibility and achievability and matters like that. The various climate change plans over the years have purported to deliver on those pathways, and the pathway annual and interim targets to start with, and now the current plan purports to deliver the budgets leading up to net zero. But we have to recognise that one thing where we have failed is we've failed to meet those 9 out of the last 13 annual targets, and we had the challenge of the 2030 interim target leading to the change to budgets, etc. So the big question is, although this current plan purports to deliver the budgets and net zero, will it do so? And there are 3 challenges, I think, there in answering that question. First, will the policies and proposals be implemented? I mean, we have to remember that many of the positives of the CCPU have actually not been implemented or have been delayed. And in addition, of course, there's the issue of the 166 recommendations the Parliament made as to whether they were taken on board and implemented. The second challenge is, will the policy outcomes, the changes in behaviour, the changes in the way that we travel, the ways in which we heat buildings, etc., will those outcomes be delivered from the policy measures being implemented? And the third question is, will those outcomes lead to emissions reductions or removals that are predicted? And the answers to those 3 ifs, really, the first one depends on ongoing commitment and delivery. And at the moment, we don't have a good track record. The 9 out of 13 missed targets demonstrate that. And so the kind of delivery questions and the checks on delivery that James talked about are really important. In terms of the second 2 questions, the second 2 ifs, the draft plan, unfortunately, lacks the details and the transparency for us to reach any conclusion. We can't tell how the modelling has been done, how the analysis has led to the predicted emissions reductions, etc. So, although the plan purports to meet the budgets and the net zero, whether or not it does meet those emissions reductions targets is really a matter of judgment and whether you and given, in our view, the absence of any new policies, and given that we've been missing targets for 9 out of 13 years, you would have, and we're now moving on to the hard stuff, as I described earlier, you would have expected to see some new actions. There are further delays, for instance, in the Heating Buildings Bill. There's a lack of ambition in some areas. Take peatland as an example of that. There's a rollback on some of the Climate Change Committee's advice on, for instance, dietary change or livestock. And all of that, we believe, leads to an over-reliance on negative emissions technologies, which...
We'll come on to particular sectors a little bit later on, but yeah.
All of that leads us to believe that actually the plan doesn't rise to the challenge of the emergency.
Okay. Kevin, any very brief comments, please? We need to move on.
I'll try and keep them as brief as possible. I agree with virtually everything that's been said there. I think we have to remind ourselves the 2019 Act was very clear. It's about Scotland's fair and safe emission budgets in line with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Articles 3 and I think Article 4. The 2045 zero emissions, net zero, not even real zero, net zero emissions by 2045 framework is what you determine is fair and safe. However, the science has changed. So it is no longer an appropriate framework to have 2045. And also when it comes to both the CCC's Carbon Budget 7, but which I've unpicked in some detail elsewhere, not so much with the Scottish one, but I've tried to do my best here looking at the Scottish pathway, the balanced pathway. The carbon emissions under the balanced pathway for Scotland are equivalent to 3 times, between 3 and 4 times, the equal per capita division of the global budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. In other words, if you took the global budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade, divided it amongst 8.5 billion people, Scotland's balanced pathway assumes that the Scottish people should get 3 to 4 times more than the global average. Now, why should that be? That's deeply colonial in my view. If you take the 2 degrees C carbon budget, it's still more than equal per capita. So Scotland is still saying, for under a 2 degrees C budget, we should get more than the average for the rest of the world. Given that, and I don't know the numbers exactly for Scotland, given that the UK is about the 10th richest country in the world, that its emissions per capita historically are about, we're fourth, I think, highest, and the emissions per capita, historical per capita emissions are 4 times greater than the global average. Scotland has far more to do under its signature in the UNFCCC under the equity part, this thing that's given this terrible name of common but differentiated responsibility, than just doing equal per capita. So I would say that if you want to deliver on the fair and safe budgets in line with the Act, you have to go back and say the balanced pathway given for Scotland, and indeed the one for the UK, for the CCC, is far removed from that. It is neither fair and nor is it safe. So it asks, again, much deeper questions. And this goes back to the point of the emergency. We had an emergency in 1939. We responded accordingly. The idea Scotland hasn't been able to do the work on its houses is because it hasn't decided to have an emergency. It declared an emergency, but it didn't have any policies aligned with it. You're still selling 4-wheel drives and sports cars and big houses. And so this is not just Scotland. This is true everywhere. We all make these rhetorical flourishes, and then we deliver absolutely nothing in line with those flourishes. So I'd say at every level here, if you follow the Act, you just do the maths and the science, then you end up with very different pathways to the ones that are actually underpinning the plan you've got here. And even the plan you have is far removed from anything touching what you would call an emergency.
Okay.
You know, we are where we are in 2025.
Thank you,
and the physics just sees through rhetoric.
Yep.
So we have to be a bit more honest. Either we're going to fail, and then we should look at what levels we're going to fail to start to plan for that. Or we have to start to pull our finger out and do something in line with what with our commitments are.
Okay, thank you, Kevin, for that. I'm aware of time, so I'd like to just ask the panel then about, and if I could get some brief comments on this, please. Are there particular sectors within the plan that you feel could go faster, or are there some sectors that are being identified that actually will struggle to go so quickly in terms of emissions reduction? And are there particular policies or proposals under those sectors that you feel there's a question mark about in terms of they're too ambitious or not ambitious enough? So if I could get some brief comments on that, start with you, Lloyd.
Yeah, I think that the one sector that will struggle, in our view, is the CCUS nets issue. We think that there's an over-reliance on removals through those technologies in as much as they will be extremely expensive. In our view, they're unreliable and unlikely to deliver. There is very few, if any, examples across the world of those technologies already delivering or showing any sign of delivering. And therefore, whilst we are not opposed in principle to continuing research and development and looking at opportunities and there being potential limited scope for deploying them in particularly hard to decarbonise industries or whatever, the scale of the reliance that this plan puts on those is excessive in our view, and that is in part a consequence of some sectors, in a sense, not being asked to do as much as they could in order to therefore make the sums add up. So moving on to those sectors that can go faster, we think agriculture is a particular one where the Scottish Government has specifically decided not to follow the CCC's advice in relation to dietary change and livestock, and that is an area that could be addressed. In other areas of land use, there's an awful lot more in terms of sequestration by land use in forestry and peatland restoration, which where there could be more ambition. And my final point, I think, is that in transport, the vast majority of the emissions reductions that are predicted come from electrification of vehicles, which is a good thing. But relying nearly exclusively on that is unfortunate in a sense that electrifying all the existing forms of travel is not going to solve issues like congestion. It's not going to deliver health benefits. It's not necessarily a fair way of doing the decarbonisation. And whilst there is a policy section on modal shift, the predicted changes and emissions reductions are very modest, and we would like to see that extended or being more ambitious in terms of shift to public transport, shift to walking and cycling, etc. So more investment in those matters to generate modal shift in addition to electrification of vehicles, not instead.
Butt in here just very briefly. I'm just conscious that only 2 of us have had questions, and I know there are another 5 panel members who are wanting to ask questions. It's fine for the witnesses to keep talking. I have to work with the 5 other panel members that you're excluding. So could you just be kind to me before Christmas and try and keep your answers as short as possible so I can bring them all in? And because, Lloyd, you've mentioned it, and I think 1 or 2 other panellists have mentioned it, I'd just like to remind members of my register of interest that I am a livestock farmer and I have an interest in a livestock farm in Murray. Doesn't mean that I don't agree with anything you say, but you should just, people bear it in mind. Sorry, I think Mark was next, and your brevity it would be a benefit for my Christmas. Thank you.
Right. So overall, I think the big questions I have about this plan are deliverability and evidence. I think I agree with what's been said on deviations from CCC. You know, there are obviously reasons for that, and agriculture. I'm not, so I'm sort of a generalist when it comes to energy world, but I'll transport expert in UK Energy Research Centre, and we've had a number of those. I think one of them might be on your next panel, Gillian Annable from University of Leeds. A lot of the work that we've done over the years points to what's been said, that there is a good opportunity to do more on the demand side of transport through policy around modal shift and reduced sort of demand for transport. One thing, it's just quite difficult to work out where the emissions reductions come from in a very integrated way because of the way the evidence is presented in the plan. So it's much easier in the Climate Change Committee's advice, and there it is. It's very clear that electrification is the huge enabler of all of this. The plan doesn't really say much about electrification because it's seen as UKG or business responsibility. So underpinning the plan, the huge risk and uncertainty is, are we going to get all this electricity available to do these things on transport and heating? Hardly mentioned that issue. In heating, again, kind of colleagues in UK Energy Research Centre, Professor Jan Webb, who's given evidence to another committee earlier on this, is very critical of what she's seen there. Lots of sort of aims rather than proposals. The proposals aren't really proposals, and what's been said very much resonates with what she said. There's been rowing back on ambition in heat and buildings, and a sort of a statement of ambition rather than proposals. An area where Scotland was very much at the forefront earlier. So I think, just to be brief, the concern here is not really the fine-tuning of sectors. It's what's the deliverability and evidence for this, and how is it going to happen? Yeah.
Thank you. Do other panelists want to come in? Jess, do you want to come in briefly?
Quickly, just to mention, I'd endorse, it's difficult to see the detail. There's good ambitions, but just understanding the how, so I'll not go over that again. A couple of things which may not otherwise come up. There's, and actually this is perhaps missing an opportunity to make us help us to understand and see how robust the plan can be, that there's not much about collaboration and leadership that's happening in other areas and how that relates. Now, I know it's not all specifically necessarily required, but actually education, connections with health, tackling poverty, public procurement, public funding, some elements of that. All of these need to be integrated in order to ensure delivery, and these are essential. So understanding how these things relate to each other is kind of missing. Okay. Agree with other commentators on the heavy reliance of, for example, on CCS. And it's unclear what will happen if that doesn't deliver. And there's a history here. So in October 23, the Executive Director of the IEA said the history of CCS has been that of great disappointment. And, the story in a nugget that has been captured, this comes from the Climate Reality Project on CCS. 20 years ago, worldwide, they were able to capture 4 hours of annual emissions. Over the last 20 years, they've made improvements and now able to capture 12 hours of annual emissions, 51 million tonnes. But how does that compare to the emissions that we need to be capturing? It's just a scrap. That's actual emissions in 2024 were 37.4 billion tonnes. And according to data from IEA and Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I can provide the committee with the links to this. But I think maybe there's an opportunity, and I'm kind of inspired by one of the new public, in the public lobby, there's one of the new speakers that says, getting curious about what's going on there and why is there an established view is maybe something to think about in the context of this plan as well.
Okay. Briefly, James, then Kevin. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. I agree with everything that's been said, of course, but one sector that I feel does deserve mentioning is the circular economy. The word is used under waste in Annex 2, but it's not developed and barely mentioned. Kevin's emphasised that we live in a global community, and this is a global emergency. And what Scotland is doing is offshoring a lot of its emissions. And I understand we're talking about a target for territorial emissions here, but we have a moral and human rights obligation to think about the wider world issue. Scotland's territorial emissions have fallen, 50%? But if you take the carbon footprint, that includes consumption here in Scotland, then it's only fallen 20%. We're offshoring a lot of our emissions. And it just makes sense to be rapidly developing a more circular economy because so many of our emissions here in Scotland are related to our use of materials. And we have a very high per capita use of materials, and they're very largely virgin. Scotland has barely begun to develop a circular economy.
Sorry, you're saying that sector, or embedded in other sectors, that approach could go a lot further, or are you saying that actually consumption targets are not clear through the CCP?
Well,
and we should be building that in some way.
Yeah, it's just not addressed, and it's not being mentioned as a possible solution. And there have been estimates of how many million tonnes of territorial emissions would be reduced by a fully functioning circular economy. They're a bit all over the place, so I won't even quote a number, but they are significant. So, it needs to be addressed, I think, both for the global impact and really to make our economy and our civic society here far more resilient in the face of accelerating climate change, which will disrupt supply chains, global supply chains.
Thank you.
It's good for the economy, good for employment, good for GDP, and reduces emissions.
Okay, thanks. Kevin?
Just to reinforce the views on CCS, carbon capture storage, and whatever you want to call them, negative emission technologies, engineered removals. These do not occur globally. There's 11 million tonnes were actually captured and stored. The 51 million tonnes includes enhanced oil recovery. In other words, what we captured, we used to squeeze out more oil. If you look at the bit that's actually used and stored, CCS only delivered 11 million tonnes globally in 2024. That's 1/3 of Scotland's emissions. That was globally. If you look at carbon dioxide removal, it was 0.6 million tonnes. 0.6 million tonnes were stored, collected and stored geologically in 2024. In other words, 0.0003% of global CO2 emissions. I mean, yes, research them, but take them out of your plan because they do not exist at scale today. They're a ruse from the fossil fuel industry to maintain their thriving sector. The transport one, I have to say, I think really that needs unpicking, but this is here the same for the CCC. This belief in electric vehicles. Yes, if you're going to buy a car, buy an electric car. But just think about this for Scotland. Scotland's got 2.5 million cars. 2.4 million, over 2.4 million, are still internal combustion engine cars. If you're going to swap them out for one, which is what the CCC assume, and as far as I can tell is not far off what you assume in the plan here, that's another 2.4 billion electric cars. Each car weighs 1.5 to 3 tonnes, has a battery that's 50 to 100 kilowatt hours. So that's a huge amount of resources, financial resources. Just think, 2.4 million cars, if you multiplied that by, let's imagine £25,000 a car, that's pretty cheap. Because remember, you can't buy them second-hand because they don't exist yet, they're new. That's £60 billion just in the cars. That's ignoring any infrastructure, any electrical charging, any renewables to actually generate power for those cars. And also remember, as Gillian will, I'm absolute certain will point out, 96% of the time, cars are parked. So in Scotland's plan, it intends to spend a huge amount of financial resources, labour, capital, political capital, on a technology that 96% of the time it's parked. And some clever person will tell you, oh, we can use them as storage. Well, about 40% of Scottish households don't have off-street parking. So I don't see how you're going to be charging those very conveniently. And also, we don't know how people will be using these cars. So I don't think it's sensible to say we just assume that there are storage capacity. There'll be some storage capacity, but not a lot. So the idea that we're locking ourselves into this ongoing industry, and just also think about that, each car is 1.5 to 2 tonnes. I weigh 80 kilograms. So typically a car is to take someone like me that weighs 80 kilograms and I drive 10 kilometres to pick up a couple of bags of groceries or a small child from school. We've normalised in our urban environments a mad form of transport, and now we've got an opportunity to think differently, but we're not. We're just going to swap out internal combustion engine cars for electric cars with all the problems that will cause and the huge costs associated with it, and still the air pollution from the tyres as well. So I think we really have to think very differently. On aviation, it throws in that the CDR, the negative emission technologies for aviation, sustainable aviation fuels, a nice little acronym. Yeah, well, it's 2% of current aviation fuel in the UK is SAF. And if you look at the SAF mandate from the UK government, you're not allowed to use agricultural feedstocks. So unless Scotland's going to convert all of its diets to fish and chips, then it's not going to be able to provide anywhere near. It's just a token gesture, SAF, in terms of what you can provide for aviation. But because the aviation industry has also got a stranglehold on our policymakers, people just think we can apply this sort of SAF thing, which means we carry on expanding our airports, we carry on buying the planes that last for probably 20 years, we lock in more kerosene use, all under the ruse of some future SAF protocol. And even if you produce the fuel synthetically, there are huge energy issues about producing synthetic kerosene from electricity, which we won't get into here, but it's a long way off and a huge demand on the grid. So I think on transport, again, it's just a few technical ruses that have been thrown in there, rather than thinking fundamentally different about planning, about active travel, about public transport, and all of those other things need to be factored in there in a really serious way, not in the sort of token gesture way that they're put into the plan at the moment.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. We need to be really careful, just saying, on all of these things. Just please try and help me prior to Christmas. We're 10 o'clock now, halfway through the session, and we're 4 questions in of potentially 12. So please cut it short where you can. I understand that why people feel passionate about this, but if you could help me, it would be appreciated. Bob, over to you. And Monica, thank you for agreeing to drop the supplementary on the basis of time. Bob.
So, Convener, I hope my question will be helpful, but it'll also be brief and it'll be technical. So that would be helpful. I want to better understand targets in the draft climate change plan derived from direct policy intentions of Scottish Government and what is actually baseline policies. And I just want to check, Convener, that I've understood it correctly. So if you look at transport, now I'm just using transport as the example, I can see that there's an expectation that 26 to the year 2040, there will be 23.8 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent reduced in terms of direct Scottish Government policy, but the overall amount will be 38.3, if my eyesight doesn't fail me. The point being, the difference between those two things is Scottish Government direct policies, and the others could be other external factors, which could be private sector change, it could be UK government policy, but it could also be cost of energy, it could be dietary changes, so things not directly within the Scottish Government's control. So my question is, there's numbers in the draft plan in relation to that. How best do we understand those numbers? Is there enough information to allow people like yourself to make an informed view as to whether those numbers stack up or don't stack up? And is there need for more transparency around how the modelling work has arrived at to get to those numbers? So it's not a question about is the plan going to be successful or not. It's about how can we best understand the numbers in the plan in a reliable way. So, slightly lengthy question, Convener, but I've tried to be very specific in what I'm asking. Lloyd Austin.
Yeah, thank you. I think when I referred earlier to a lack of details and transparency, this is one of the areas that I was particularly thinking of. You're right that for each sector, the plan suggests a baseline, which is, in effect, what would happen to emissions if the Scottish Government did nothing. And those baselines vary. So in agriculture, they fall, and in transport, they rise. And then the emissions reductions that are predicted from the policies in the plan are from that baseline, if that makes sense. And in each time they present a baseline for each sector, there's a series of assumptions that are set out. And so, for instance, for transport, the assumptions include a forecast of future demand, car miles driven, passengers per plane, assumptions around consumer choice, technological progress, fleet replacement, etc. But there's no explanation about those assumptions. So each sector, there's a paragraph in the plan listing the assumptions for the baseline, but there's no explanation about what that means and how that may or may not, or could not be influenced. So, you know, that means that in terms of the baselines, there's a lack of clarity. And I think that in terms of providing greater transparency and understanding whether or not the plan will deliver, those kind of assumptions ought to be explained. The second part is the emissions reductions from that baseline. Again, they set out the policies and proposals to deliver those things and then tell you what the predicted emissions reductions will be. But that is as a result of the modelling work, which again includes assumptions, so that if you, for instance, set up a grant scheme for installation of heat pumps, they say, or the model predicts that X percentage or Y thousand people will take advantage of that grant scheme, and there'll be that number of households that change heating. And what the plan doesn't deliver, doesn't show, is how that modelling works. It's a black box. We just have to, in a sense, either believe it or not believe it, depending on what we, you know, are on. And we would very much like to see more information about those assumptions and those modelling assessments, so that we can understand whether or not we should have faith in them or not. At the moment, it's a black box. It's not transparent.
I think that's helpful. I know Jess Pepper wants to come in here, Dr. Winscoe. Jess, just in answering this, maybe one more reply after this. If there's a consistency of answers, we can move on, much to the convener's appeal, I think, in relation to this. So, Dr. Winscoe, I'll take you after Jess Pepper. Jess, just in responding to this, I'm assuming that I would make an assumption that government assumptions fall within a range. So the government can't land something to the exact, you know, pounds and pence of cost or carbon reduction threshold. There'll be a range, and what you might want to know is, what is the range the Scottish Government is working from as it went for the most optimistic part of that, the most pessimistic part of that, Is it laid it bang in the middle? But what's informed the Scottish Government's views? Lloyd Austin seems to be suggesting there's just a void at the moment in terms of understanding that.
Well, that's the reality, is that we don't really know. We don't have that level of detail. And one certainty, so I was going to keep it short and say we need more transparency and we need more of that kind of information. What are the assumptions based on? One thing we can be sure about is that things will shift as well for various reasons. And that comes into, you know, the indicators. If we're measuring one thing, are we measuring where things might have gone in another direction? And also comes into risk as well. I don't know if you want to talk about that separately, but yeah, we need more transparency, more information in order for that to be tangible and for people to be able to bring their insights to it and understand what's going on and how it will change if assumptions do shift or aren't, you know, the basis of them changes.
I think that's it. Assumptions are just used on the best predictability and estimates of data at any given time. They should change, of course they should.
Yeah, so knowing what that's based on, but remembering particularly on transport, that our track record's not great here in reducing emissions on transport. So, you know, what are we basing our assumptions on? We just had to scrap the 2030 target. Presumably that was based on assumptions that haven't come to fruition. So, you know, we need to be confident now.
That's helpful. I'm sorry for truncating your reply, Jess. Dr Winscoe, do you want to add anything and then we'll pass back to you?
Yeah, so I think you've identified an issue here with the way the information is presented, which is the baseline. Okay, so the way the emissions envelopes are presented in Annex 3, which is where the details are, such as they are, presents it in terms of overall sectoral emission reductions, baseline pathway, and then policy, CCP policy costs. So, and all that's costed in the plan is the CCP policy costs, and not all sectors do that. So for transport, I'm not sure I've got this right, but I think about half the emission reductions in transport are on the baseline. So the plan costs are about half of what's being delivered. Now, that's kind of reasonable to some extent if you're saying other people are taking care of those costs, and what this plan is about costs to Scottish Government, the Scottish public purse. But that needs to be a bit clearer, I think. The UK Government followed the same approach when it published its carbon delivery plan recently. But in that case, we had all kinds of details. I mean, there's quite a lot to say about this, but so we don't have those details. But there's the other kind of issue that I am concerned about is that each sector has done its costings differently. So what we don't have is a consistent approach to the treatment of costing and where the costs are appearing. So if you read the building sector, which is a huge area of cost, it's surprisingly a low cost figure that's presented in the plan, both in the first report, the summary report, and in the details. It's much lower than transport, for example. And that's surprising because for almost all analysis, buildings is the biggest single capital cost. It's there in the CCC plan. It's there in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's analysis. So why is that low relative to transport, for example, and others? Well, in the buildings bit of Annex 3, it says that costs associated with delivery of the clean heat target are included in CB1, first 5 years. For subsequent carbon budgets, they're not costed because they're just proposed. There's so much uncertainty about second and third carbon budget periods. The costs aren't there, as far as I can see, which is a huge area where costs aren't seem to be represented. It just seems very odd. It's said for domestic buildings and residential commercial buildings appear in a different sector. And then just the other thing you said, which is also very important, is there's no uncertainty analysis here. There's no scenario up middle, upper bound, lower bound, mid-range, which is what is done in most of these exercises, and it will have been done inside government, but it's not represented, so we're just given a central point. And there is actually one sector that does this, which is the industrial sector. They do talk about 3 scenarios that they've developed, and you're given the mid-range and you're given upper and lower bounds, or at least they're referred to. But it's odd that each sector has seemed to have gone about that in a different way. you would hope for some, consistency of analysis across the sectors.
So I won't follow up on that, Dr Brinscoe. That's very helpful, because if they can do it, if government can do it for one sector and provide a range and give a bit of an explanation, why not across the board? That's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Bob. The next questions come from Douglas.
Convener, and I think I'll be brief because we've covered bits of this already. The Scottish Government have stated that they will diverge from the Climate Change Committee advice on some of their pathways. We've touched on it already. Obviously, there's alignment with things like car and van decarbonisation, but there is divergence in things like agriculture and peatland restoration. Do you understand why there's divergence? Have the government set that out in their plan? I'll maybe come to James first of all.
It's, again, not transparent, I think, and not clear to me why there are those divergences from the best available advice. So it may be that others on the panel will know the background to that. But yes, it's rather mysterious, and why just one or two sectors in particular? One imagines it's something to do with the acceptability, the feasibility, the political ramifications, but I'll turn to others if they have greater insight than me.
Lloyd, I'll come to you. It was almost a hand I've seen, so.
Thanks. I agree with James in generality that it's not set out in full. And the agriculture divergence is, I think, a very significant one. Particularly as things like dietary change are actually built into the agriculture baseline, even though so some of the baseline decline in agriculture is due to predicted dietary change across the whole of the UK that Scotland will follow just as a result of sort of customer preferences that they predict. But then, unlike the CCC advice, they don't adopt any policy of seeking to make that change go faster or be different of any type. So that's very concerning. The one area that I was going to add to is in relation to peatland. They haven't accepted the CCC's advice for the total or the per year hectarage of peatland that can be restored. And in part, I do understand why that is, because they haven't met previous year's targets for restoration because of practicalities, availability of machinery and labour, etc., etc. And so they've built in a slightly lower per year target because of that practicality. And that is understandable, except that I think that they should actually have policies to address those issues of labour and machinery, etc., so that they, in the later years of the plan, they can increase the target, if you see what I mean. But they haven't done that.
Okay. So, Lloyd, you mentioned dietary change was in the baseline decline. But I guess, do you think that's why government have avoided those additional savings from agricultural? Just because that would almost be a policy on diet change, really.
Yes, the CCC advice is that there should be a policy to encourage lower meat and dairy consumption, but they haven't adopted that. So the plan just has that baseline change. They haven't gone further. Except I will point out that the NHS health advice is to reduce meat and dairy consumption. So actual average consumption is above the NHS advice for healthy diets, and yet we apparently can't adopt that in our climate change plan. So the health department and the climate change department have different approaches.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a view on this one? No? Good.
Thanks very much, Douglas. Michael, I think you've got some questions.
Yeah, this is obviously the first carbon budget which the Scottish Government has produced having previously gone for the annual targets. And clearly there's been experience by the UK government where I think they're on to their 6th carbon budget, although I think 2 previous ones were ruled as being unlawful in that they didn't comply with their climate change legislation. I wonder if does moving to carbon budgets from annual targets give you greater confidence in the level of progress that's necessary being made? Lloyd?
Thanks for picking on me. I don't think I would say yes or no to that question. I think it's a different way of measuring progress, for sure. I think in terms of the overall monitoring and reporting and evaluation process, I think it's important that the government has agreed, and the Act last year that you passed includes the annual reporting on emissions going forward. So although the budget is over a 5-year period, we will in each of the 5 years of that budget see annually whether or not we've achieved 20% of the budget, if that makes sense. So the debate about whether we're on track will still be there. I'm not sure that my confidence is based on whether or not it's an annual target or a 5-year budget. My confidence is based on more whether or not the policies are robust, whether they will deliver, whether there's the delivery machinery to deliver them, etc. That's what will define whether or not the plan works. In a way, it doesn't matter how you report and measure as long as you do report and measure.
Wonder, James, do you have a view on whether there are lessons that could be learned from the experience of using carbon budgets by the UK government for the Scottish government's approach?
Yeah, it strikes me as a sensible move, just statistically. It's more robust, and admittedly some of the missed targets in the past were because the rules changed for doing the calculations, the rules developed by the IPCC and so on. Mid-year, if they change, then you have to back-calculate, and yeah, it creates a degree of noise in the signal, and that in itself can be important because missing targets undermines public confidence, dare I say even political confidence in the robustness of the plan and the ability of Scotland to deliver on what it says it would. So doing a 5-year budget removes some of that noise in the signal, and therefore you get a more credible kind of result. I was the advisor to the Isle of Man government when they decided to create a Climate Change Act and a Climate Change Plan, and I helped compose those. And having learnt from Scotland, yeah, we put budgets in that one rather than annual targets.
Okay. Jess?
Yeah, I think for the public, it's easier to get a handle on annual targets and to understand the progression. You know, you can see visibly where we're going and the milestones within that. Budgets are probably feel less transparent and maybe feel like it's not as easy to be accountable to those because it's harder. There's more in the mix. So I think in terms of communication tools, and there's a lot in this which matters a lot about communication, it's how the accountability is clear and the transparency is clear that we're on track and we're delivering, and you can have confidence in this. Confidence has got to be key for folk to feel like that's held. So I think that's probably easier in annual targets, but maybe a bit of work is just going to be needed in that area.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly different point, but I think what's missing here again is annual policy costing. And I think there was some hope and expectation from bodies like SFC that we'd see that in this plan to align annual government budgets with delivering the plan. So at some level it's useful to have these 5-year budgets, and everyone's very used to that, and things fluctuate from year to year, and there's all kinds of year-to-year differences which make meeting annual targets difficult at some years. So I'm comfortable with 5-year carbon budgets, but what is also needed is budget lines for annual spend. And of course, you can't do annual projections with any real confidence over 20 years. Things will change a great deal, but it shows up that the analysis is there, and there's a rough idea of what the midpoint estimate at any one period is. They'll be needing constant updating, but they're not provided at all here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can I turn then to the sort of policy areas then? One of the Kevin, did you want to come in? Sorry.
Yeah, just quickly on that. I think both budgets and percentage reductions are useful. So for people like me, and indeed probably quite a few of those providing evidence today, we use the budgets. They mean something to us. It allows us to test what is being proposed against what is necessary, in this case for fair and safe response from the Scottish Government. So it allows us to do that sort of analysis where an annual budget is slightly less robust for doing that sort of work. However, I think for most people, and indeed I would probably suggest for most of you here, if I said, well, we've only got 15 million tonnes in the budget for the next X years, that would mean nothing to most of you, I think. But if I said you need to reduce emissions by 8% every single year, and that's 3 percentage points higher than we did during COVID, then you'd probably have some sort of handle. Well, that sounds like a lot. So I think it depends upon the person who's using them as to which of those is useful. So I would say both are helpful. The budget ones for us sort of geeky analysts, and probably a percentage reduction ones often for the public or for people who are less familiar with the sort of details of the science and so forth, which the budget framework fits more closely with. So I think both are helpful.
Okay, thanks. Can I turn maybe to policy options now? Because we've obviously got a Scottish target of achieving net zero by 2045 and a UK target of 2050. One of the things that I think in the past has often been underestimated is the interlink between policy options that are taken by the UK government and how that impacts on Scotland's targets, and also the targets that Scotland sets, the options that then has an impact for the rest of the UK or for the UK target. I wonder if I could turn to you, James. Do you think the draft plan properly reflects the interplay of policy options that the Scottish Government need the UK Government to implement in order to support it and assist it and be able to achieve its objectives? Transport, let's say, take transport as an example.
I think you can probably guess my answer. The answer is no. There's insufficient right across the whole plan on those interdependencies, which can be internal policy dependencies within Scotland, UK, or even wider in terms of trade agreements and so on, which is a whole area in itself that merits some attention. So, yeah, it's very, very difficult to assess those. They need to be assessed as time passes. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning, that a robust, professionally managed approach, the professional programme managers will be assessing that constantly, assessing the interdependencies and changing the route map and changing the decision-making procedures, changing the budgets, changing the resources allocated, depending on a whole range of interdependencies. It's fundamental to good programme management. Okay. Lloyd?
I would very much agree with what James said. I would add a couple of things. I think in some areas of the plan, that it kind of describes what the Scottish Government would like the UK Government to do to help it deliver on its plans. And in transport, for instance, it talks about how it would like to see vehicle excise duty and fuel tax and other measures that are reserved be changed so that it could contribute to the changes in travel that they like. In other areas of reserved areas, it's relatively silent, and it doesn't identify what it would like the UK government to do. One very topical and sometimes controversial issue where it's silent is on oil and gas. So despite us having a draft energy strategy that talked about oil and gas futures several years ago now, we don't have a finalised energy strategy, and the plan is quite silent on what it would like, what the Scottish Government would like the UK Government to do with its reserve powers in that area. And we would like them to be much more robust in arguing the case for a managed just transition and rapid wind down in oil and gas production and use. So that's one area where they could do more. And aviation, as Kevin mentioned earlier, is another area where there's an awful lot of reserved policies where actually the Scottish Government could, if it wished, take a lead in arguing the case for faster and more robust action by the UK Government in those reserved areas.
Okay. Mark.
The SFC report on costs of mitigation, the recent one, says that 81% of expected public spend by 2050 resides with Scottish Government devolved areas. So this is a plan for Scottish, if one thinks about where emissions reductions have come from up till now, you know, 3/4 of that has been from electricity supply, which is a mostly reserved area. This plan says this plan says very little about energy supply. Costs are, I think, are zero throughout the period because they're seen as UKG responsibility. So this is a very different plan. This is costs for transport and buildings, which are essentially devolved to the most part. So, but I do agree there's an issue about so there's one thing is the political risk and delivery risk that's presented through what's happening at Westminster and changing politics of net zero. So I said already that this plan is underpinned by a massive expansion of the electricity system. I mean, it's remarkable how 3 times by is it 2035 and 4 times by 2045. It has to quadruple in size. So that has to happen at the GB level, and the GB grid is managed as a GB entity with all kinds of why we have huge congestion charges at the moment is because the grid isn't adequate for shipping renewables around the country. So none of that is really mentioned. That kind of underpinning delivery risk needs to have better kind of profiling. I don't know, because the philosophy of the plan is very much deliver the additional Scottish policy costs and focus on that. And that's what we see in the plan, really, in terms of costings and emissions reductions. It's that part of the problem. But delivering that is affected by, obviously, what's going on outside at UKG and other things. So it would be good to know how that's been thought through. What if, if people have said CCS is not part of their preferred pathway here. Well, if UK government decides it isn't for them either, then what does Scottish government do about the Scottish cluster? It's very difficult, and so that those things just need thinking through and presenting, really. And I would like to have seen a bit more about thinking through those kinds of what ifs. How do we make up shortfalls and contingencies?
Okay, thanks. Jess.
Yeah, I think
Kevin's wanting in as well. I didn't know my microphone was on. I was gently reminding the deputy convener that Kevin wanted to come in as well. I'm sorry if I put you off your stride, Jess.
It's okay.
I apologise.
Go ahead unless allowed. I wonder if there's an opportunity here, actually, because there's plenty of content in how these relationships with UK work within the annexes. And here we have an opportunity to structure our climate change plan so that everybody can see where all the roles and responsibilities lie. So across government, but across the different parts of the governance, different directorates within government, public bodies, but also the connections with civic society, with business community as well. And actually structuring that clearly, which is what I feel like we keep coming back to, is just being able to be super transparent about what we need to do, how we're going to do it, who's going to be involved, where does the responsibility lie, what do we need to do by when, how is that going to be resourced. If that was really clear and accessible, then, in the ethos of the Parliament, it could be open and accessible, transparent and participative for everybody in this nation to get involved in, to be able to pick it up or go online and check out where are we, what's the snapshot right now. Why have those assumptions changed? Do I understand that because there's been this event, or this has shifted in the global context? But also, there'll be challenges and there'll be opportunities, and I think we're kind of missing the opportunity here, and we really need to grasp it, because what I am hearing, and seeing is that once folk get plugged into this, climate action in their own communities or in their own workplaces or in their own schools and campuses, actually there's an energy there and there's an excitement to let's get this done, and it's going to do so much good as well. So I think structuring the very core of the plan, this isn't about somebody having their plan over here and someone else having their plan over here, which is what's happening on the engagement right now. Folk are developing toolkits and nobody knows how these necessarily all join up together, because there wasn't necessarily a plan for the engagement, because it wasn't anticipated and shared amongst those who needed to be involved upstream, months in advance. It was shared at the end and introduced to folk, here's what you need to do 2 weeks after the consultation had actually launched. There's no need for that. We knew it was coming. We could all have been involved. We could all participate in a much more fair way as well. So let's not miss the opportunity that we might have ahead of us. A lot of this is restructuring and spotting. That helps us spot the gaps as well.
Okay, so as ever with a plan, there's usually a price tag attached to it as well. So you've mentioned heating buildings as one of the big emitters, an area where there's a need for significant investment in order to address issues, a need to also change people's behaviour around transport, much more in the public transport space, and expanding and developing that. These big capital costs to the Scottish Government. UK Government decides to cut capital expenditure within its budget. That then has a direct impact on the capital allocation to the Scottish Government. What should the Scottish Government do in those instances if that then undermines the carbon budget that it's trying to pursue on reducing emissions from buildings or reducing car usage by investing into alternative means of travel? What should we do about that? Jess, just given what you were saying earlier, we've got a plan. Who's responsible? What should we do?
Well, top line, that if it's communicated clearly whose responsibilities and what the context is right now, if there's a shift in that, it's easier to point to it and say there's been a shift here. This is what's happened. How do we respond to that? And it opens the question up more widely to a collective response as well. Scotland has amazing, has had, and this has been disrupted in recent years, huge understanding and knowledge and solutions focuses, for example, on community transport. And that is an area of learning. People can figure out, what are the options. People who are having these conversations and coming up with solutions and sharing their experience and learning in their different communities across Scotland or in their different working contexts or their lives can share, can see, and there can be, if we have the processes in place that support such a plan, then there's a means to switch. So I'm not getting into the detail of that, but just if you've got the mechanism, the framework in place to be able to clarify that and go to our established processes, that can be very inclusive and is a quicker way to get to solutions than just a policy that might have to then be filtered down and doesn't necessarily benefit and respond to the experience across our communities.
Okay, Mark, you said that 80% of the costs associated with tackling climate change rests within the Scottish Government side of things. What do we do if the UK Government changes its budget profile, which then has a direct impact on the Scottish Government's budget allocation to be able to do these things?
Right, so I'll try and get to an answer to but one of the things the CCC does is they have a great chart, I've got it here, which is how costs and benefits over time change. And there's a black line which kind of, after the midpoint, or just after the midpoint, goes into benefit rather than cost. So the whole challenge here is how do we smear costs over time? How do we get over this hump of capex, particularly for heating? Transport isn't as much of an issue because consumer choice will drive that to a large extent as EV vehicle costs go down. There's obviously, the cost of grid strengthening and the things that Kevin's mentioned. But the big two of these upfront costs are electricity grid, which is a UK kind of GB network companies are charged to, network companies are allowed to invest on that. So that's a sort of, at the moment, largely covered by electricity bills. The big one for the Scottish Government is capex on heat. Now, the evidence suggests that's mostly about, there's a question about the balance between heat pumps and heat networks, which has been around for a long time, that debate, and the shift here, based on, in the plan and based on what the CC have said, is this is mostly about electric heat pumps. So, and I know there's a concern about pushing back on heat network legislation. So that's a specific concern that's now seriously lagging, that there isn't requirements on heat network development in the way that there was. On capex on heat pumps, I did some work on this myself with others in Newkirk, and there is a big challenge here because it's quite difficult to get heat pumps as cheap as what people are used to. The big challenge is, how do we persuade people to replace the gas boilers with heat pumps for many homes? So the work that I was involved in said you can't really do this. We've had great cost reductions in things like PV, solar PV, and wind power, and increasingly now electric battery technology. It's difficult for heat pumps because they're a bit more of a complicated bit of kit, and they're quite disruptive in some people's homes. Now, people differ about how disruptive that is, but what struck me about that is that over their lifetime, heat pumps are very attractive. They're much more efficient, energy efficient. They involve much less energy demand going into heating than the way we do it at the moment. So why can't we devise a clever policy to just smear the cost over lifetime? Why can't we offer a heat service based on heat pumps? Why can't we do rental schemes for heat pumps? I'm still wondering why we can't do that. There's no mention of it in the plan. Other countries are looking at that, and there are some interesting pilot schemes in places like Germany. But it's a common international challenge, and it needs to be gotten over, because I mentioned before that I don't think the costs are presented on the heat sector, and I think one of the things is it looks expensive. It looks very expensive, and it's politically challenging to put that on the page, I suppose. I don't know. The analysis will have been done, but I think there is intelligent policy ways around that. I'd like to see more work in those areas and more pilots happening in Scotland on those.
Okay. James, and then I think it's Kevin.
Kevin, yeah. Sorry.
Are you going to Kevin?
No, Deputy Conveners, I think, singled you out first, James, and then to Kevin.
You wanted to say something.
Okay, yeah, very briefly, I agree with what Mark was saying there, and it's beginning to happen to address the nature crisis, which I've experienced a little bit. But there are mechanisms now for blended finance, de-risking, stacking of returns on investment and so on, which can make private investment attractive. And overall, this climate plan, at the end of the day, makes money, doesn't it? It breaks even and goes a little bit into the black at the very end. So there are strands within this plan where, with the right policy background, the right kind of de-risking from government, I'm sure private sector money can be involved. If you can get private sector money involved in biodiversity, surely you can get it involved in some of these sectors. So again, it comes down to having a robust, managed plan that can be flexible and adaptive as the political and economic framework begins to shift around it.
Okay. Thanks.
We're going to go to Kevin. He's waiting.
Kevin, sorry.
He's waiting patiently.
Well, the first point I'll make is going back to the earlier question about the budgets. When you look at 2045 or 2050, if you look at it from a budget point of view, this is just noise in the system. It makes no difference. They're both aligned with roughly a 3 degrees C warming future. So the budgets help you understand, does that make any difference, the difference between the UK position and the Scottish position? Those 5 years, remember, they're not zero, it's about net zero emissions. So if you look at the budgets underpinning them, they're very, very similar. Just to point out the net zero for the UK, we've still got 30 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel combustion in 2030. And go back to some of the earlier points, the reason we've scammed that is because we just assume there's going to be negative emission technologies will suck that out of the air in the future. Our children will deploy these things. That allows us to have these net zero framings. So I'd say 2045, 2050, from a science point of view, they're both 3 degrees C futures. In terms of the other points that have been brought up, completely agree with Lloyd on oil and gas. Oil is mentioned. The word oil is once in this report, in this document. This is a carbon plan for Scotland, but it's got a huge oil and gas industry that I used to work in, used to design and build offshore oil platforms, and oil is mentioned once. And gas isn't mentioned at all in relation to, it's got one mention to gas, but I think there's no reference to it in terms of the industry. So on the heat pumps, I just think it's interesting. Look at Sweden. A long time, worked quite a lot of time in Sweden. For a long time ago, Sweden switched to heat pumps and district heating from an oil central heating system. Very similar to the UK. We have a gas central heating system. They have an oil central heating system on average, and they switched very rapidly from oil to heat pumps and district heating. They did that a long time ago. There was no climate emergency. We now apparently claim a climate emergency. And we're still banging on about how challenging it is to make these things work. They've been working in Sweden, which is quite a chilly country, some similarities with Scotland. Been working there for decades now. And on the costing sides, I always find a lot of these financial approaches, they're sort of manufactured. I mean, you can change things with discount rates and so forth. So you can sort of make arguments any way you want. Personally, I like the idea of standards. You put a standard in place, the financial directors of companies squeal, and then the engineers deliver. This is, the history of standards is just like this. That in the end, the industry delivers because the engineers find out how they can do something. As long as it's within the reasonable rules of physics and technology, the engineers find ways to do it, and it's broadly affordable. And that's across the board. Whether you're looking at Formula One cars or where you're looking at heat pumps, I mean, it works across the board. So I would say have the courage to put standards in place that drive the industry, and basically put your fingers in the ears to the financial director's squeals. I said that's the sort of way I would try and deal with some of the economics of this, which I think are fairly spurious. And also you have to bear in mind, when you look at economics, and I don't see anything in here, say, the cost of doing things has to be compared to the cost of not doing it. Well, a 3 degrees C future, what's that cost for Scotland? Who's estimated that? So you've got to make these comparisons between if we do nothing or we just play around with with the climate change game, then we will have to put in place the wherewithal to deal with, or the best we can, to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so I think that part of the cost structure is simply missing from the balance sheet.
Okay, thanks.
Kevin, I think you've got a follow-up here.
Thank you, Convener. We live in a world where anti-climate change rhetoric is growing. Jess said earlier that she sees energy and excitement from people around about change. I don't see that, I have to say. I've been knocking a lot of doors of late, and it is not one of the top issues. It probably was higher up the agenda previously. And I have to say that folk listening to this session will probably be somewhat bamboozled by what has been said, because about the plan itself, folk have asked for more detail because there are too many assumptions. But what about the what-ifs? There has to be assumptions built in. We've heard about flexibility and being adaptive. We have had various things said about what's missing, what should be in, and yet, again, folk don't want too many assumptions, but they want more detail. I just wonder what people out there will think of all of that argument. What I would say is that a lot of this is about delivery. Professor Curran earlier mentioned his flood risk management in Scotland arrangements for 2012-16, talked about how that was done, talked about the project managers and the rest of it. But when it comes to delivery, has that in itself worked? And I would pose a point around about an area of Scotland that I don't know particularly well, but which is featured in this Parliament quite a lot, is the flood risk at White Sands and Dumfries. No delivery there, and yet that featured, I'm quite sure, in your flood risk management in Scotland plan. So why, in all of this, have we had the argument around about the plan today? What's there, what's not there, what should be there? Why have we not thought about the what-ifs? And why are we not talking more about delivery? Professor Curran.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, what an interesting question, and I'm very glad it's come up. Yeah, the bit that I was responsible for delivering was delivered, I promise you that. Subsequent, of course, the local authorities with central funding need to actually did.
Cut in there, please,
yeah,
convener.
Sure.
I recognise the bit that you were responsible for was delivered, but the reality is the practicalities of flood defences and flood risk management have not been put in place because there have been arguments at lower levels. Now, we're arguing today about a climate change plan, right? And the Scottish Government is not going to be responsible for the delivery of a huge amount of that plan, right? But you want all of the detail of that, which the Scottish Government is not responsible for. The reality is quite simply that this is about delivering. We can put together, the Government can put together a plan that looks immense and entirely workable, that maybe everybody could eventually agree on. Doubtful. But, you know, none of that works if there's no delivery. And this is my point. So we're arguing the semantics here about all of this, and yet delivery is the key.
Yeah,
delivery is king or queen in all of this, is it not?
And I absolutely agree about that. It's what I said right back at the beginning. It's all about delivery of this plan. Yeah, I won't go back into the detail of the flood risk management.
But I wish I actually would, because at the end of the day, you said that your part was delivered.
Yeah, it
but
was.
The reality on the ground for people who have faced flooding in various parts of the country, it's made no difference. They're still being flooded.
Well, there has been a lot delivered, and the whole purpose of the Flood Risk Management Act was that risk would be assessed, and therefore, through that risk assessment, a prioritisation of public spend. So that was part of the highly charged political element of that particular programme, that politics was right at the heart of it, because you're right, local communities get very worked up and very stressed, and it has health impacts and numerous other impacts if they're at risk of flooding. But there was a prioritisation mechanism put in place so that public spend was used on the riskiest and the most damaging flood at that time. And of course that list is being worked down through over the years. But on the wider question, I think it's very important that the public do remain fully convinced and convicted about climate change. And the opinion polls show that the Scottish people are very stable in their commitment to climate change. I mean, I agree, environment, climate and so on has dropped down the list of top issues. I think it's now down at about number 6 or 9, it depends on your opinion poll. It used to be, along with environment, I used to look at those opinion polls very closely, up at number 2, 1, 2, 3. The World Economic Forum still has its top 4 global risks as climate and nature related. So, you know, it's not gone away. It's very reassuring to me that the Scottish public remains stable in their commitment. 72%, I looked up these numbers, 72% think climate change is an immediate and urgent problem. 44% think reaching net zero would improve their lives. And that takes me on to the kind of codicil to that. And it is a missing feature for me of this draft climate change plan. There's no narrative in there that gives people the feel of what living in a net zero world would be like. Yeah, it's all costed out, and as you kind of hint, it's a very nerdy discussion, very technical discussion, which we have been having here. And you're right, I'm sure 95% of people would be mystified or turned off by it. There's no narrative that gives the emotion that actually is about human rights and about the lifestyle we can lead and our contribution to the planet, and that people will have a better life in a net zero future. That's missing, and that runs the danger of the people in Scotland beginning to lose their so far stable commitment to acting on climate change. We get an impression that the political realm is wobbling a little bit, certainly internationally, maybe within the UK, maybe even within Scotland. So it's vitally important that the public remain fully committed, fully engaged, in order to give the politicians that reassurance that they are doing what people want.
I'll take Mr. Austin now then, please, because he's signalling.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with James that it's an interesting and important question, and I agree with James also about the opinion poll things. I think there's a range of responses to that, though, and the first is that we're having a very technical, I say nerdy discussion about the details of a plan, and that is one aspect of a government's response to the climate challenge and the legal responsibilities it has. But associated with that, it really ought to have, and I know there are plans for this, how if advanced and effective they'll be will have to be seen, but there needs to be a communications and engagement strategy to go along with it, where you use different explanations and messages for different audiences styled to in the appropriate form, so that you can embed and even enhance that widespread public support for action on climate change. And one of the aspects of that I think that's important is, as well as specifying costs, I think there is an element of this in the documents at the moment, but it doesn't come out in the overall narrative as much as I think it could do, and it certainly should be used more in that sort of wider engagement strategy, and that is specifying the positives, the benefits of delivering on such a plan. That obviously includes economic benefits, and there are some very good estimates of economic benefits in the plan. But I think it's equally important to stress the non-monetary benefits, the improved health, the improved lifestyles, the not spending all the time in traffic queues, etc., etc. And also, I think, as Kevin hinted at earlier, that the costs of inaction, and there's one reference in there to the Office of Budget Responsibility report, but a lot more could be done to pull that out and include this in the narratives of what it would be like in 2040 and 2045 and 2050 if we did nothing. What would it be like living in Scotland if we did nothing? And that would, I think, strengthen. I just wanted to make one more point about your question, and that is about asking for more detail. The Scottish Government must have the detail that we've been asking for in order to have the high-level figures that they do put in there. I completely accept that they can't put in detail that's held by the UK Government or others, but they could specify where those gaps are and which things the UK Government could better provide. So, yes, they must have some of the detail we've been talking about, because otherwise they couldn't have put the high-level stuff together in Annex 3 that they have. There must be workings behind those figures.
So, again, and I'm really playing devil's advocate here, and again, back to the delivery or the lack of delivery, or folk not wanting a project to be delivered. You talked about the costs of inaction. The people of White Sands in Dumfries know that there is a flooding risk. They know the cost of inaction, yet many of them don't want that flood prevention scheme. So, again, you know, you talked about the communications about all of this, and you talked about not everything is monetary. But for many folk out there at this moment in time, the lack of income that they have, their struggle to pay their electricity, their gas bills, and their food bills, is the top priority without a doubt. And money in their pooches are to think about, really.
Sorry,
Jess, I said I would come to Jess next.
Sorry.
Please, Jess.
Thank you. It's interesting because I hear this said that folk aren't talking about climate, but actually what often we find is that people are talking about climate and maybe not framing it all the same way because people are talking about it in different ways. Folk are talking about food costs rising and their energy in their homes and damp in their homes, and folk can get quite animated about waste and how they get about, and there's all of these things which people and their future and their children's futures, all of these obviously relate to climate. Our experience within climate cafes sometimes, so this is the climate cafe movement has been entirely organic. We realised in one community that actually folk might appreciate, because of what folk were saying to each other about certain things, folk might appreciate a space just to talk about this kind of stuff. And so created that space, and it turned out that other communities liked the idea of having that kind of space as well, and that's just been completely organic. There's never been any promotion that this is what you should do in your community. It's just been community to community to community thinking, oh, actually I can get involved in this chat. And what we've learned is, and this is just through observation and sharing of experience, is that actually sometimes folk, it's not a conversation we're maybe used to having. And it may be something that's bothering folk, or they're wondering what's happening, or they're concerned about things like food prices rising and stuff that's happening in their own place or in their own work setting or whatever. And actually when folk share knowledge and understanding and get access to more information about what is happening, maybe the science and the impacts and what solutions are out there and actually what's happening in their own community, what business leadership there is on the doorstep, for example. It kind of animates the conversation so that folk get plugged into, right, this is what's going on here, what can I get involved in? And actually what has been completely organic again is the switch to action. Folk want to know what they can do, but also what others are doing, so what their government are doing, what the local authority are doing. And in some cases, now over 10 years, we've seen that folk are getting into these conversations with their local government and with their senior management in their school or whatever.
You, Jess, and
yeah.
I recognise all of the work you've done there, and I recognise that folk have become engaged. But that's a very small amount of people.
So the most important thing is that this isn't my work. This is folk just saying we want to do the same thing. And I appreciate that that's only a bit of, some communities across Scotland right now, but the interest in doing similar things. But people engaging in their own conversations in their own places is not unusual. And with their peers, with their friend groups, but the key thing out of that learning is that, once folk feel confident in that conversation, they become much more involved in it and want to focus on the action. Which brings me to what you're saying about the plan. I don't think, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but certainly from my perspective, I don't think we want anything that's more complicated, but it's almost simpler to understand. We are in an emergency. This is complex. There's lots of folk will need to have different roles and responsibilities, and there's lots of things will need to happen. Some, at the same time, some will need to go ahead of each other. There's all those interrelationships. There's almost layers to this that you can dig down deep into if you want to find out more about what's going on or want to get involved in something. So, for example, there's a lot of interest that I'm hearing about folk seeing what's happening in Europe about like micro solar. Being able to do, maybe balconies aren't everything here, but in parts of Europe they are, but having something that's very accessible to generate your own electricity. Now that sits right on the cusp of devolved and reserved responsibilities, but understanding whether there's an option that, could be an opportunity to take some of the weight off the grid if it's done at scale across lots of Scotland. We've got solar can work here too, but where does that fit? So understanding where all of these different things fit together is something that folk do get really interested and want to dig into and understand, and that might relate to their own passions and interests or experience as well. So if I'm correct, actually having something which is structured simply but is very accessible and transparent and clear in its language. Some of the numbers which Kevin is using might not be known to everybody, but they could be much more accessible if presented in a way which is manageable for people to understand. So communication is absolutely key. We're not all having that conversation right now, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that's because there's not interest, because the stats, as James has shared, actually suggest that people are passionate and do want to see change in this area.
Mark, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly, really, that I agree with what you're saying. This is a more difficult time to be doing this, and this isn't top of the list for people. There's also a very active media that's looking to pick holes in this at every opportunity. So there's an anti-net zero media which is just ready to go every day with stories about this. And it's often miscommunication, it's often how the costs are presented. There was a recent report by the Network Energy System Operator about the sort of long-term benefits of transition, and it was reported in the Daily Mail had a story about how this is going to be so much more expensive, and other media were saying this is to everyone's benefit in the longer term. So one has to be very careful as we're talking about it, how these things get reported. And we all want to support the government, I think, in this plan. We want this to be the best plan we can be.
But can I stop you there? Because today, in terms of your evidence, and you say you're supportive of the plan, even though there's been a huge picking of holes in it today. But you know what's going to be reported from this today, do you? Mr Austin has concentrated a lot on agriculture. He wants everybody to eat less beef, basically, meat products and dairy. That'll go down with, like a lead balloon with many folk, including many folk that can't afford such things at this moment in time. There has been talk about reduction in cars. I've got no skin in the game. I'm not a driver, never have been. And again, that will be the thing that's reported. There will be the talk of putting in what folk see as very expensive heating solutions. Again, no skin in the game because I'm already all electric. Right, but you can see exactly where this goes. And each of you today, in terms of your evidence, picking holes in a plan and not talking so much around about the delivery that's required to deliver, has provided the headlines for the anti-climate change brigade, and has probably reduced energy and excitement amongst those folk who recognise that climate is an issue.
So I'll just, the reason why we pick holes is because we want to be confident about this, right? We want to go out there and support it, and I want to be able to go out there as an independent academic and just say this is, very well based. The reason why that matters is because if we get this wrong, the headlines are going to be a lot worse. If Northern Ireland ran into problems on its heat subsidies because it was a poorly designed policy mechanism. The UK government has promised incredible reductions in the cost of heat pumps that just weren't deliverable. Now, it'd be nice to think they were, but if we do the analysis and we think, there's no evidence for that, we don't have confidence in what's being proposed here, and there's a lot of money at stake. So this is about, it may seem a nerdy exercise, but it's the basis on which we can go out there and promote the plan and support the plan and enable this to happen.
Convener, I think I'll leave it there, but I would point out that, Professor Curran in his flood risk management in Scotland delivered his part of a plan which actually hasn't delivered on the ground. And my fear about all of this is that we get too exercised by the climate change plan itself rather than the delivery. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, we're out of time, but we've still got questions to go. So I'm going to go, I see you want to come in, Kevin. I did say to the others at the start of this, unfortunately, you couldn't say it to you remotely. I can't bring everyone in all of the time, and I've got to try and balance that with the need to get my committee members in as well. So Mark, over to you, and then over to you, Monica, afterwards.
Sorry, I was waiting to hear what Kevin Anderson was going to say, but we don't want to hear what he's got to say. I'll move on to the next question.
Well, you can... I mean, Mark, I'm sorry, I'm in the most impossible situation.
I understand, convener.
Which would you like? Would you like to give up some of your questions to hear Kevin's response, or would you like to ask your question?
I'm here to listen to the evidence, so I would like to hear a brief contribution from Kevin Anderson, if he wants to make one, and I'll move very quickly on to a final question for myself.
On that last point, then, I think it's absolutely key that the speaker, the questioner, was raising there. Let's be clear about this. We are not all in this together, whether it's on reducing emissions or on the impacts of climate change. Equity and fairness, which is barely touched on in this report, is absolutely essential. I would argue there is no cost of living crisis. What we have is a manufactured crisis, and it's a crisis of fairness and equity. The median household income in Scotland is £37,000 household income. The average professor gets £85,000, an MSP £75,000, the First Minister £182,000. What we have is about 1/3 of Scottish households in fuel poverty. It is not their job to dip in their pockets to solve climate change. What we need to be doing, we have to recognise they are locked into terrible houses, poor transport, and lots of other bad infrastructure around them. The way we have to look at this is we have to move the resources that currently furnish the luxuries of people like me, and indeed many of us here today, move those resources so that we can actually put the infrastructure in place, things like retrofitting the poor quality houses in Scotland, putting in place the public transport systems. All this plays out well for health for these poorer communities. It all plays out well for employment. We've got 3.7 to 4% of Scottish people are unemployed. So there's plenty of jobs opportunity here. But to do that means moving the resources from those of us who actually have done disproportionately well at the current system, the resources, the labour, the finance, across to this infrastructure, which will help everyone. If we sell this message we're all in together and ask the significant number of households who are struggling today that they have to dip into their pockets, then of course they're going to have other priorities, quite rightly so. But if you recognise we're not in this together, you start to see fairness and equity as a key part of this. It opens up very many more ways to look at this. Most emissions are discretionary. We've got scientific evidence to show that the top households use 5 times more energy than the lower income households. 5 times. So unless we are prepared to open that equity box, which most of us are quite wealthy are unprepared to do, but unless we're prepared to do that, we're going to go on with this manufactured cost of living crisis, and we will not be able to respond to climate change in any reasonable time frame.
Reading about that in the Daily Mail. I've got a final question, convener. It's just around contingency measures, and I think, Mark, you mentioned this earlier on in relation to carbon capture and storage and the ACORN project. Now, I know that the UK Climate Change Committee had warned, I think, 3-4 years ago that the Scottish Government needed to have a plan B around ACORN. There's a very high dependency on nets, particularly in the third carbon budget. But I'm just thinking in terms of the plan, how should the plan actually deal with that kind of contingency question? Should there be trigger points in there? Because it feels like from one plan to the next, there's been a kind of putting off of the decision on reliance on the gas grid, for example, for heating or carbon capture and storage. And it feels that, a lot of these kind of dependencies kind of sit there, and there needs to be perhaps a contingency measure brought in, a trigger point where governments have to make a decision, really, or say, do you know what, this is not going to happen, therefore we need to go to plan B. I'm going to bring you in, Mark, and if there's anybody that has anything they want to add on to the back of what Mark has said, then please indicate. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're a little bit different in my mind, that we do need contingencies for a lot of these areas, and it might sound, a bit sort of dancing on the head of a pin, but there is obviously a serious question about CCS that's come up today. There are, the Scottish cluster appears in the CCC's own analysis. It's expected to be online quite soon. There's more money, much more than ever before, going into industrial clustering at both governments' levels. So the future might not look like the past in terms of the track record for CCS, and I think this is the time to get serious about CCS if it's going to be a significant contributor. And bear in mind all the kind of concerns about industrial kind of futures in heavy industry in Scotland. So contingencies matter, but they need to be thought through systematically. So what if we don't get CCS? Where is the shortfall made up? What kinds of sectors can make up shortfalls? It's quite hard to see here, in my view. People might say, you can go a lot faster in some sectors, but there's a lot going on here. But that isn't addressed. I think trigger points, well, the point at which you would say we're pulling CCS, that's no longer feasible, depends on, what, how things go with the cluster investments, the two leading clusters, which are not in Scotland. But we need to see, can this work economically? What kinds of role is there for hydrogen? There's no kind of absolute answers to this. And, CCC have changed their mind a lot about things like nets and CCS. I think that's a healthy thing because it changes up, the evidence changes, relative costs of different options change all the time. So we just need to allow that to happen.
Okay.
Thanks. Some things need an earlier look than others, because if you're going to get anywhere by 2040, this is a 15-year plan, then CCS has to start happening in the next few years. So we should know.
Understand. Thank you. Lloyd, briefly.
Yeah, I would agree about the importance of any plan like this having a sort of complete programme management system associated with it, which identifies interdependencies and identifies contingencies, and the monitoring process has indicators that when the indicator reaches a certain point, you bring in one of the contingencies, etc., etc. And I think that there are two things that leads to. One is, which Mr. Stewart mentioned, delivery is key, and James and the Climate Emergency Response Group have made some really good positive recommendations about delivery mechanisms and the governance associated with how you convert any plan into action. And it does include issues like programme management and contingencies and so on. On the specifics of CCS and nets, I made our views on over-reliance in this draft plan clear earlier, but you, Mark, mentioned Plan B, and I think one of the ways of addressing that over-reliance would be to have a contingency and a Plan B. And I just remind you that the proposal for a Plan B was made by the then Eclair Committee 5 years ago in response to the CCPU as one of its 166 recommendations. And I would very much hope that a Plan B would be another recommendation for this plan, and that plan might include, that Plan B would include an explanation of what the trigger point would be that would trigger its implementation, as opposed to Plan A.
Yep. Thank you. Back to you, Convener.
Monica, your questions.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm very conscious of the time pressures. I want to pick up on an issue that the witnesses have mentioned already, particularly Jess' paper, and that's about whether the plan needs to be clearer around the governance and accountability arrangements that support it. So I know that time is precious, but I'd be keen to hear from other witnesses if they agree or disagree with Jess on that. And also if I could hear from Jess about what exactly needs to change. Jess, you mentioned the structure of the climate change plan and how that could be improved. I wonder if you could give a few examples around that, and whether you think that that government has the skills and the knowledge to do that, or do they need to engage with some outside help on that? So maybe I'll come to Jess and then hear from others who want to comment on this theme.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was suggesting that the structure and the layout of the plan could be clearer and more accessible. And one thing which I've been checking with the Climate Cafe Network, who share some voices from communities across Scotland, hear what they're saying, in the chats that they've been able to have so far. There's a concern about accountability and accessibility coming through strongly from folk. So I think being able to see with clarity what the different sections are, how they relate to other things that are going on, who will be leading on these things, what, you know, the infographics kind of suggest timelines that things will be done by, but it's not clear always how those things will be done and what, you know, what the timings. So a lot of the time, if you're on the outside of this sort of government institution, or you know, you're not in the sort of swim of the Parliament, you don't necessarily know what's coming when, and when you might be able to get involved, and when you might be able to participate or share your experience and inform something to be stronger. So if that could all just be set out more clearly, that would really help. And it's not that all the information is necessarily missing. There would be a lot of ambition from new stuff. And I think if we were to go back and look at what communities said in the big climate conversation in the summer of 2019, we would find a lot in there that folk are still saying now, that we could be figuring out where does that fit, or is that something that's additional, or is somebody delivering on that already? There is so much scope for collaboration here, and it's really good to see that the Cabinet Secretary, the spirit of that opening statement in the introduction, the ambition and the spirit of collaboration and opportunities for discussion. What sometimes you can find is there's sometimes a bit of a gap, an operating gap maybe between how that is delivered. So there's it's alluded to how local authorities or individuals on the ground might be, you know, in their own communities, doing their thing, whatever our roles are in life, contributing. How are we going to be involved? How, you know, do you need to read it in this dense document, or is there going to be a process that involves people further? We had heard from the discussions previously that there was some discussion about, and I saw from the call for views, about what people had aspirations for in the plan. And we talked a bit about the dashboard idea. And, you know, I think what I'm hearing from folk in their own places is that, as echoes of themes that they have in their chats already, they'd like to understand what's happening on their topics of interest. You'll find in these conversations, folk will all have, they're all unique, so they'll all have different priorities at that time. And folk will want to go and search about what's going on in relation to that priority, and also to be reassured and have confidence that progress is being made, so that they know what's actually going on. I think we'll hear a lot of this coming out in the next few months in the run-up to the election, folk wanting to know a bit more about what's happening in particular areas. I'm hearing about a lot of plans for hustings, which is really interesting. That's kind of new in this space. It's obviously happened before, but this is community-led hustings across the country.
Jess, if I can just
on that.
That's all really helpful, and I look forward to some of those hustings. Hopefully I will get an invite. But what I'm hearing is, aside from people rightly wanting information, and that's encouraging people want to be involved and play their part, but aside from improving the presentation of the plan and making sure we have the right balance of infographics and so on, is there still a question mark around where responsibility lies on many of these system changes that we need to see? Do you think government needs to be clearer on who is responsible, who is taking the leadership role in certain sectors and certain actions? Because I think if we get that clearer, that's when accountability and transparency can work more effectively. So I see you're nodding. I think others may be nodding too. So just briefly, Jess, and I'll bring in the rest of the panel if that's okay.
I think that's absolutely the case. We just need that clarity right there. But we also need clarity on what the processes are to support, develop and deliver. Delivery is key, and we need to know how that is going to happen. We also need to, there's something about it being live. We need to know if that delivery is not happening, that we don't find out in 5 years' time and think, folk could have got, you know, and we could have seen and helped and contributed and informed. There's so much learning across the country, you know, in terms of all sorts of leadership, which is informing other parts of the world. And yet, we're not necessarily employing that ourselves. Sorry, I'm being told to be quiet, and it's quite late.
Told to be quiet. You're being asked to keep it short. We are nearly 30 minutes late
Absolutely,
for the next panel, which actually puts me in a very difficult situation. I know you all want to come in, and Monica will want to hear, as we will all want to hear your answers. But a couple of sentences does it for me, please. Sorry to be difficult, but I've got to be mindful of the other witnesses. Monica, you've got Lloyd, James and Mark wanting to come in, and I suspect somewhere in my background I could expect Kevin wants to come in. So a couple of sentences each, please. Lloyd, James, Mark and then Kevin.
Okay. In terms of changes to the plan, the things we would like to see is more detail in terms of the modelling and the disaggregation of the emissions calculations so that we can really see that and assess the credibility of those. We'd like to see strengthened actions in the types of issues that we've touched on before, but I would particularly like to see the governance and delivery mechanism strengthened, including a kind of real program management approach that sets out on a Gantt chart type system who is to do what, when, where, with what money, etc., etc. And that would help, I think, deliver the type of issues that you were just flagging up about clarity of who's to do what.
Liberal use of punctuation there. That's about 5 or 6 sentences. I am going to move on, James. I'm sorry, I've got to do this. Yeah. I hate doing it more than anything else in the world, but I have no option. James.
I get it. I'll be one sentence, I think. I agree with all that complexity, but we also want simplicity to make it approachable. And you may know it, but I would take a look at the Glasgow City Council. The Climate Action Plan is its title. It's on the web, 2026 to 2030. To me, it's a model of good portrayal of a climate plan.
Mark.
Okay, what should I say? So there is reference to co-benefits here, and there is some interesting work done on co-benefits from Edinburgh Climate Change Institute, which could be featured more significantly because that has been costed there. I think if I was a local authority, I wouldn't quite know where my responsibilities lie on this, and that's incredibly important for things like heating. So why, it's very difficult. So I think attributing actions following on from the plan, but this is all underpinned by a kind of pyramid of the good granular analysis is there, the sectoral kind of confidence is there from the granular analysis, the priorities for spend are all there, and then we can go out and sell this, confidently across the country. So these all depend on each other, these things. Yeah.
A bit like Lloyd, use of punctuation, good. Right. Kevin, do you want to come in?
I think the plan needs to be layered, if you like, so and with appropriate language, so you can delve deeper if you want to, and then it becomes more and more expert language as you delve deeper. But from a simple summary right at the beginning, and secondly, what is the we can find some other word for this. What is the punishment for those people who do not deliver on what they are tasked with delivering? And there has to be something. If we fail, then you can't just fail and there be no comeback on that. So there has to be some mechanism by which we deal with failure, and people know what that will be in advance.
Okay, Monica, do you have a brief follow-up for anyone in particular?
Yeah, I'll just make this my final question. I'll leave aside some of the communication issues with the public. I think it's been covered throughout the session. Our ongoing relationship with oil and gas has been mentioned both by Kevin and by Lloyd earlier. So I was reminded that back in 2021, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance was launched in Glasgow during COP26. And at that time, the Scottish Government stated it was in active discussions about joining. Now, I've asked several parliamentary questions on this, so there's been no development on that. I just wonder, given what both Kevin and Lloyd have said, about the importance of phasing out oil and gas production and doing that in a managed way, a just transition. Does it matter that Scotland hasn't joined the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance? What's the significance of that? Or just leaving it hanging there, does it send out mixed signals about the Scottish Government's position? So briefly, Kevin and Lloyd, please.
Which order?
Okay. Kevin and then Lloyd.
Yes. Point well taken. Scotland should have joined the BOGA initiative, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. not least because it would be one of the few so-called developed countries that is really trying to drive that agenda. So its influence within BOGA is really important.
Lloyd.
Yeah, I'll reiterate what I said about oil and gas earlier. It's very silent in the plan and it should say more. I agree with Kevin about beyond oil and gas. I think other international initiatives and partnerships that the Scottish Government can get into are very valuable as well. I would also suggest the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is another mechanism that's ongoing in the international debate. But whilst all of the international aspects of the Scottish Government's work is creditable and should be encouraged and they can do more, that has to be matched by delivering at home, because otherwise your credibility in the international fora is undermined. So delivering at home is equally important.
Okay, thank you. Monica, I'm afraid we're sort of almost out on this session, as it were, time-wise. I would like to just ask one very simple question, which elicits a yes, no, or don't know answer. So the question is this a good draft climate change plan? Lloyd.
It's a start.
That's none of the three. So let's see, James, if you can improve on that.
It's a good draft.
Okay, Mark.
Unfortunately, no, it isn't a good draft. I have to be honest.
Okay, Jess.
Yeah, there's work to be done.
Okay, Kevin, you get the final say. Yes, no, or don't know.
No.
Thank you. I thought I could rely on you to give a definitive answer. Look, thank you very much for all your evidence this morning. It's been a challenge for me to try and get all the answers in on time. I'm sorry if you don't feel you've had the opportunity, but you've had longer than we anticipated. I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting till 11:35, and thank you again for the evidence, and have a good Christmas.